Don't touch her again. The maid is still pointing. Gray dress, white apron. Her finger aimed at the woman on the marble floor like a verdict. She isn't shaking. That's the part that surprises even her. She thought her hands would shake. They don't. They remember what they did and they are not sorry. The woman on the floor is wearing red. The kind of red that announces itself before she walks into a room. Her hair fans out across the marble like she staged it. Her hand is at her cheek, pressing, but her eyes aren't wet. Her eyes are calculating, running numbers, deciding which version of this story wins. Behind the maid, a wheelchair. In the wheelchair, a woman in blue, 71 years old. Silver braid over one shoulder. Her glasses are somewhere on the floor. Her left cheek carries a print, 5 fingers, blooming, and she is sitting very still the way a person sits still when they have learned that stillness is the only safe thing left to them. The door opens. A man in a dark suit fills the frame. Tall. The kind of man a city bends around. He sees his fiancée on the floor. He sees the maid standing over her, still pointing, still certain. He sees his mother, in her chair with someone's handprint on her face. 3 people. 3 stories. 10 seconds to decide which one is true. He looks at Dorothy first. And Dorothy does not look away. She had told herself on the morning she took this job that she would be invisible. That invisibility was the skill. That a maid who is not seen cannot be removed, and a maid who cannot be removed can protect. She had been invisible for 63 days. Flora ended that in 1 second, the second her palm connected with Angela Cooper's face. Dorothy crossed the room before she decided to. Her body remembered things her mind had spent years trying to forget. And now here she is, visible, irreversible, standing over a woman who has never in her life been stood over. Bryan Cooper is still in the doorway. 10 seconds. Dorothy keeps her finger pointed, not at Flora, she realizes. At the truth. At the handprint on Angela's cheek that has been there in one form or another for months. Ask her, Dorothy says. Her voice does not shake either. Ask your mother whose hand that is. Before we get into the story, please like and subscribe if you are yet to do so. Thank you. She was told the penthouse was on the 43rd floor. She was not told it would feel like standing inside a cloud that had learned to be cruel. Dorothy Gil stepped out of the service elevator with one bag and the particular posture of a woman who has survived enough to stop being impressed. The floors were white marble, the kind that reflected everything. The city below, the sky above, and Dorothy herself, small and gray in her uniform, moving through a room that did not expect her to have a history. A housekeeper named Sue briefed her in under 4 minutes. Keep the surfaces clean. Mr. Cooper does not take breakfast at home. Mrs. Cooper, the mother, Sue clarified, dropping her voice as though the distinction needed softening, is in the East Wing. She doesn't speak much anymore. Just make sure she's comfortable. Dorothy asked what comfortable meant. Sue looked at her for a moment, then looked away. Federal clean. Quiet. She found Angela Cooper by the window. Not placed there. Not wheeled there for the view. The old woman had positioned herself at the exact angle where the morning light came through without the glare. The calculation of someone who had once moved freely through rooms and now moved only in her mind. Her silver braid rested over her left shoulder. Her hands were folded in her lap with a precision that looked like dignity and probably was. She did not look up when Dorothy entered. Dorothy did not announce herself either. She moved to the side table, straightened the water glass that didn't need straightening, and stood quietly for a moment in the particular way she had learned, present, but not demanding to be acknowledged. Then Angela spoke. Not words. A sound. Low and tuneless, barely breath. A bar of something old, something Dorothy almost recognized, a melody that belonged to a different decade, A different woman. Dorothy turned. Angela's eyes were still on the window, but her fingers had moved. One hand tapping the armrest. Slow. Keeping time. Dorothy pulled the small chair from the corner and sat 3 feet away. Not close enough to intrude. Close enough to listen. She stayed there for 40 minutes. Nobody came to check on either of them. It started with a record player nobody had touched in 8 months. Dorothy found it in the corner of the East Wing sitting room, buried under a folded throw blanket the way you bury something you're not ready to give away but can't stand to look at. A Thorns. Beautiful. The kind of machine that was built when people still believed music deserved ceremony. She asked Sue if she could use it. Sue looked at her the way people look at questions that are technically permitted but socially incomprehensible. "It's just collecting dust," she said finally. Which was not a yes but was close enough. Dorothy cleaned the needle with the edge of her apron and found the small crate of records beneath the cabinet. She did not choose something cheerful. Cheerful would have been an insult. She chose something honest. A low, aching jazz standard that understood that some mornings are not good mornings and does not pretend otherwise. She set the needle down and went back to her work. For 3 minutes Angela did not move. Then her head turned. Just slightly. The way a person turns toward a sound they had decided they would never hear again. That was the beginning. By the end of the first week, Dorothy would put a record on before she did anything else. By the second week, Angela had begun to request. Not with words at first. A gesture toward the crate, a finger hovering over a particular sleeve. Dorothy learned to read the gestures the way you learn a second language, imperfectly at first, then fluently, then without thinking. The words came slower. Single ones, offered carefully, like coins from a diminishing reserve. That one. Too loud. My husband liked this. Dorothy received each one without ceremony, without the breathless overreaction that would have made Angela feel like a spectacle. She simply nodded and adjusted the volume, or turned the record over, or said mine too when the song was one she also loved. Angela laughed for the first time on a Thursday. A small sound, surprised out of her by a lyric she'd apparently found funny for 50 years. Dorothy kept her eyes on the window. But she was smiling. And somewhere in the 43rd floor of Bryan Cooper's Marble Kingdom, something that had been very still began quietly to move. Flora arrived the way weather arrives. You felt the pressure change before she walked through the door. Dorothy was in the hallway the first time she saw it happen. Bryan was home, which was rare, and Flora had arrived in something ivory and effortless, her perfume preceding her by several seconds. She moved through the penthouse with the particular grace of a woman who understood that she was always being watched and had long since made peace with performing. She went to Angela first. That was the detail Dorothy noticed. Not Bryan, not the view, not the staff. Angela. She crossed the room with her arms already opening, her voice dropping into something warm and musical. "Mother, you look wonderful today." A kiss near the cheek but not quite on it. A hand placed over Angela's folded ones, covering, Dorothy thought, not holding. There is a difference. Bryan watched from the doorway with something that might have been relief. Flora straightened and turned to him, and the transition was seamless. The warmth didn't leave her face, it simply redirected, aimed now at a different target. She was skilled. Dorothy had known skilled people before and understood that skill in certain hands is its own form of danger. Dorothy moved to the side table with a cloth, invisible in the way she had trained herself to be. And she watched. 30 minutes later, Bryan took a call in his office. The door closed. Aunt Flora, still in the sitting room with Angela, did not leave. Dorothy, returning down the hallway with fresh linens, slowed outside the doorway without stopping. Flora was at the window, her back to the room, looking at the city like she was already deciding what to do with it. She said something. Low, light, conversational in tone, the tone entirely disconnected from the words. Dorothy could not hear the words. She heard Angela's silence afterward. The specific quality of it. The silence of a person who has heard something and understood that responding will cost them more than they have. Dorothy kept walking. She folded the linens in the east wing closet and stood there for a moment with her hands pressed flat against the shelf. Flora had smiled the entire time Bryan was in the room. She had not smiled once after the door closed. She found her at 11 in the morning facing the wall. Not the window, Angela's window with its 43rd floor view of the city spreading out like a promise. The wall. Blank, cream-colored, 3 feet from her face. The wheelchair was positioned with a precision that felt deliberate, the way furniture is arranged by someone who understands that environment is its own kind of sentence. Dorothy stood in the doorway for a moment before she trusted herself to move. She came around slowly into Angela's line of sight. The old woman's eyes were open but had retreated somewhere behind themselves, to the interior country people discover when the exterior world has been made deliberately small. Her hands were still. Not the stillness of peace. The stillness of a person who has stopped expecting anything to be different. The record player was off. Dorothy had left a record on the turntable that morning. A Coltrane that Angela had touched twice with one careful finger, the gesture that meant this one. The needle was lifted. Someone had lifted it. Dorothy put the record on without speaking. Set it at the volume Angela preferred, just loud enough to fill the room without demanding anything from it. Then she moved to the window, unlocked the brake on the wheelchair, and brought Angela slowly around to face the light. Angela blinked. Came back into her eyes by degrees. It was the 3rd time this week Dorothy had found her like this. The first time she had assumed fatigue. The second time she had noted it. The 3rd time she understood it as what it was, a system. Flora would visit in the mornings when Bryan had already left. She would stay 20 minutes, perhaps 30. And afterward, consistently, Angela would be found in some configuration of diminishment. Facing a wall. A meal untouched. Her braid undone and not redone, which Angela, who had maintained that braid through whatever the last years had taken from her, would never allow on her own. Dorothy began keeping a record in the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. Dates. Times. Details. The kind of information that by itself means nothing and together means everything. She did not know yet what she would do with it. She knew she would not throw it away. She sat beside Angela and put on the next record. Outside, the city glittered in the late morning sun, indifferent and vast and beautiful. Angela closed her eyes. This time Dorothy recognized it, not retreat. Rest. There was a difference. She was learning to tell them apart. She found the bruise on a Tuesday. Angela's left forearm, inside the soft skin where the arm bends. A darkness shaped wrong, too deliberate for an accident, too contained for a fall. Dorothy had seen bruises that furniture leaves. She had seen bruises that wheelchair arms leave. She had also seen bruises that hands leave, and she knew the difference the way you know the difference between a scar and a wound. She said nothing to Angela. She documented it in her notebook. Location, size, the particular yellow at the edges that told her it was several days old, which meant it had been there through 2 of Bryan's evening visits and he had not seen it or had not looked. She photographed it quietly with the discretion of someone who understood that evidence, once lost, does not return. Then she went to find Bryan Cooper. She had never initiated a conversation with him. In 6 weeks she had spoken to him 4 times, each occasion his doing, each exchange brief and transactional. She understood her position in this household and she had accepted its terms because the terms had allowed her to stay close to Angela. She found him in the study. He looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who has learned to read interruptions as costs. Dorothy told him clearly and without embellishment. The bruise. The configuration of the wheelchair on 3 separate mornings. The lifted needle. The notebook, which she placed on the edge of his desk without pushing it toward him. He looked at the notebook. He did not pick it up. He looked at Dorothy instead, and she watched the calculation move across his face. Not the calculation of a man who disbelieves her, but of a man deciding whether believing her is something he can afford. He told her that his mother bruised easily. That Angela had always been private about her discomforts and would not appreciate them being catalogued by staff. That Flora had given up a significant portion of her life to support this family, and that Dorothy, who had been employed here for 6 weeks, might not have the full picture. He said it the way people say things they are not entirely certain of. Dorothy picked up the notebook from his desk. She thanked him for his time. She kept her voice even. She left the study and walked back to the east wing and sat in the small chair beside Angela's window, and she did not cry, because crying was not what this moment required. The full picture, she thought. She was the only one in this house assembling it. She heard it before she saw it. Not the strike itself, the silence that preceded it. The specific quality of silence that falls over a room when something is about to happen that cannot be taken back. Dorothy was in the hallway with a tray, close enough that the sound of Flora's voice reached her first, low and stripped of its usual performance, the voice beneath the voice that Bryan had never been in the right room to hear. She heard Angela say something. Small and clear and firm. The new firmness, the one that had been growing for weeks through music and morning light and the particular courage of a woman who has begun to remember who she is. Flora did not like the new firmness. Dorothy was moving before the sound landed. By the time she reached the doorway, the tray was on the floor and she did not remember setting it down. What she saw, Angela's head turned to the side, her glasses displaced, the slow bloom of a handprint rising on her left cheek. What she heard, Flora's voice resuming, the tone adjusted back toward control, already constructing the version of events she would present at the door. Dorothy crossed the room. She was not thinking about her job. She was not thinking about Bryan Cooper or the Cooper Syndicate or the 63 days she had spent being invisible in service of this moment. She was thinking about her grandmother's hands, broad, certain, unafraid, and about every woman in her line who had ever stood between something cruel and something worth protecting. Her right hand knew what to do. Flora went down hard, the marble receiving her without apology. The sound was conclusive. The kind of sound that ends arguments. Dorothy stood over her. Her chest was moving. Her hand was still clenched, the knuckles remembering. Some distant part of her registered what she had done, the line she had crossed, the door she had closed behind herself, and she found she was not sorry. She was terrified, yes. Not of Flora. Not of the Coopers. Of herself, of the depth of it, of how long she had been capable of this and how right it felt to finally let it matter. Angela was breathing hard in her chair. Dorothy turned to her. Just for a second. Just long enough. Angela was looking at her with something that was not fear and not surprise. It was recognition. The look of a woman seeing for the first time in a very long time, someone who is entirely on her side. The door opened. Bryan Cooper filled the doorway the way he filled every room, with the assumption that his presence would organize whatever chaos had preceded it. It did not organize this one. Flora was already recalibrating from the floor, her hand at her cheek, her eyes performing the injury her voice would shortly narrate. Dorothy stood where she stood, unmoved, her clenched hand the only honest thing in the room. And Angela was not looking at her son with the careful, retreated eyes Dorothy had found her with on so many mornings. She was looking at him with something that had been underground for a very long time and had finally found its way to the surface. Flora spoke first. Of course she did. The words came arranged and reasonable, the tone wounded but measured. She had been provoked, she had simply raised her voice, The maid had attacked her without cause. Surely Bryan could see what was on the floor. Surely Bryan could see who was standing over her. Bryan was looking at his mother's cheek. The handprint had fully bloomed now. 5 fingers, unmistakable. The kind of mark that does not require interpretation. Angela drew a breath. And then she spoke. Not a word at a time, the careful ration currency of the last months. Sentences. Full ones, arriving steadily, the way water arrives once a dam has made its decision. She told him about the mornings. The wheelchair facing the wall. The record needle lifted. The meals left where they were placed, untouched, because Flora had told her that a woman in her condition should not develop appetites she could not sustain. She told him about the facility, the specific name Flora had used, the specific tone, the way she had said it like a promise dressed as a suggestion. She told him about the bruise on her arm. She told him there were others. Bryan had not moved from the doorway. Dorothy watched something travel across his face that she could not entirely name. Not guilt, not yet, but the precursor to it, the moment before a man understands what his inattention has cost someone who could not afford it. Flora said Angela, sweetheart, in the voice she saved for Bryan's benefit. Angela looked at her with 61 years of accumulated dignity and said very quietly, don't. The room held that word like a verdict. Dorothy finally unclenched her hand. He watched it alone. Dorothy knew because Sue told her. In the quiet, factual way Sue relayed information she considered too heavy to carry by herself. Mr. Cooper had been in the security room for 4 hours. He had asked for the archived footage from 14 months ago. He had not asked for coffee or company or anything else. Dorothy did not go to him. It was not her place, and she understood the difference between proximity and intrusion. She stayed in the East Wing with Angela, who was sleeping. Real sleep, the deep unclenched kind that had been absent from her face for as long as Dorothy had known her. The kind of sleep that comes after truth has finally been spoken into the right room. She sat in the small chair and kept the record player on low. She thought about the car accident the way she had been thinking about it since Angela had first mentioned it, obliquely, in the careful language of a woman who has been told her own memories are unreliable. The break felt wrong before. Angela had said one morning, quietly, not quite to Dorothy, the way people speak things they are not certain they are allowed to believe. I told him the break felt wrong. Bryan emerged from the security room after dark. Dorothy heard it from the hallway, not raised voices, because Bryan Cooper was not a man who raised his voice when silence was more dangerous. She heard Flora's performance escalate without him to meet it, the way a fire burns hotter when the wind stops opposing it and simply withdraws. She heard the moment Flora understood that the calculation had changed and that her considerable skills were no longer the most powerful thing in the room. Then she heard nothing. Sue appeared in the East Wing doorway 20 minutes later. Her face was composed in the particular way of someone organizing shock into something manageable. She said that Mr. Cooper had reviewed footage showing Flora in the building garage the evening before the accident. She said he had made 2 phone calls afterward. She said Flora was currently being assisted with her belongings by 2 members of the household staff. Dorothy absorbed this without speaking. She looked at Angela, still sleeping. The handprint on her cheek had faded to something almost invisible. Almost. Not entirely. Some marks, Dorothy knew, stay longer than the skin. She turned the record over and let the music continue into the dark. Flora left without ceremony, which was its own kind of justice. Dorothy did not watch her go. She heard the elevator, the main one, not the service elevator, because even in removal Flora would not concede that detail, and then the particular silence that follows when something that has been exerting pressure finally lifts. The penthouse exhaled. Dorothy had not realized how much the building itself had been holding until it stopped. She went to Angela. The old woman was awake now, sitting at her window in the early evening light, The city below beginning its nightly transformation, lights finding themselves one by one in the gathering dark, the city arranging itself into something that looked, from 43 floors up, almost gentle. Angela's braid was freshly done. Dorothy had redone it an hour ago carefully, the way Angela had shown her, 3 fingers width from the left ear, the tie at the base not too tight. Angela had guided her hands once, wordlessly, and Dorothy had remembered. She pulled the small chair to the window and sat beside her. They did not speak immediately. They had long since made peace with silence, had learned to distinguish its varieties. The silence of absence, the silence of fear, the silence of two people who have been through something together and do not need to narrate it to know its weight. The record player was on. Something slow and certain, a melody that had outlasted the decade that made it and would outlast them both. Angela's hand rested on the armrest, one finger keeping time, the way it had on the very first morning Dorothy had sat close enough to notice. After a while Angela said quietly, "You knew." Dorothy considered this. "I recognized," she said. "There's a difference." Angela was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, without looking away from the window, what Dorothy had recognized it from. Dorothy looked at the city. At the lights continuing to find themselves in the dark, one by one, patient and inevitable. "The same place you learned to survive it," she said. Angela nodded slowly, as though this was the answer she had expected and had needed to hear confirmed. They stayed at the window until the city was fully lit below them, vast and indifferent and bright, and neither of them moved to leave and neither of them needed to. Some rooms, Dorothy thought, you earned the right to rest in. This was one of them. As for Flora, she left the penthouse with her luggage and her composure and was seen at a hotel in New York for approximately 2 days afterward. Then she was not seen. Not at the hotel. Not at the socialite events she had never previously missed. Not anywhere that cameras or acquaintances or the ordinary machinery of a visible life tend to find people. Nobody filed a report. In certain circles nobody was surprised. The rumor, and in Bryan Cooper's world rumors were the closest thing to official record, was that he had made one phone call the night he reviewed the security footage. One call, 10 minutes, very quiet. What happened after that call was a matter of speculation. What people agreed on, in the careful way people agree on things they would prefer not to know precisely, was this. Bryan Cooper was a man with resources and a long memory and a mother in a wheelchair whose cheek still carried the ghost of a handprint. He was also, notably, a man who kept his penthouse very clean. Flora had counted on his love for her being greater than his love for order. She had miscalculated. And that's the end of Dorothy and Angela's story, or maybe just the beginning. If this story held you, if you found yourself rooting for the woman in the gray dress and the old woman by the window, give this video a like so more people can find it. Every like tells the algorithm that quiet strength deserves to be seen. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, stories about unlikely protectors, hidden courage, and the people nobody expects to change everything. And if you know someone who would love Dorothy Gil, share this with them. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a story is put it in the right hands. See you in the next one.